Of the 195 countries that make up the world today, none is as large as Russia. It spans over 5,600 miles, from the small enclave of Kaliningrad in the west to Big Diomede Island in the east. Russia covers 11 time zones and a total of 6,612,074 square miles. In fact, it is so vast that the second largest nation on Earth, Canada, could fit inside its borders more than 1.7 times. For well over 300 years, Russia in one form or another has maintained its position as the world's largest country. At the height of its territorial expansion in 1866, it stretched all the way from Poland to Alaska. Yet only a few centuries earlier, a recognizable Russian state didn't even exist. Instead, the region was a patchwork of warring principalities and dukedoms. Out of these, the first glimpses of a nation began to emerge, one that, through the ambitions and efforts of princes and Tsars alike, would rise to become the largest country on Earth. To understand the origins and expansion of the Russian state, it is most important to focus on European Russia, the smaller portion of the country lying west of the Ural Mountains. Much of this area is dominated by the Volga River and its tributaries. It is also home to Russia's major cities, including Moscow, Kazan, Samara, Volgograd, and Astrakhan. A fully established nation-state would not appear here until the medieval era, but the vast Pontic-Caspian steppe had long been home to many different Indo-European and Germanic tribes. Over the centuries, these tribes included the Scythians in ancient Greek times, followed by the Sarmatians, Huns, and Goths. The Goths, in particular, would go on to threaten and later help bring down the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 5th centuries AD. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the region began to show greater territorial cohesion and cultural unity, largely due to northern expansion out of Scandinavia. Although the Vikings are more commonly remembered for their raids and conquests in Britain and Western Europe, they were highly active in Eastern Europe as well. They sailed across the Baltic Sea and down the great rivers, the Volga, Don, and Dnieper, entering the Black and Caspian Seas. From there, they launched raids against the Byzantine Empire and the Arab Caliphates. Over time, these Norsemen began settling permanently along the riverbanks, founding cities such as Kiev, Novgorod, and Staraya Latiga, which they ruled as small independent city-states. The Norse rulers, known as the Rus, gradually assimilated with the local Slavic populations. Together, they expanded their territories to form the first large-scale states in the region, including the Kievan Rus in the late 9th century, and later the Novgorod Republic in the 12th century. By the 13th century, republics and principalities along the rivers and lakes of western Russia, such as Novgorod, Pskov, Suzdal, and the Duchy of Moscow, had grown prosperous through trade and commerce. Novgorod in particular benefited from strong trade links with the Hanseatic League of merchant cities across the Baltic and North Seas. But in 1223, a powerful new threat appeared from the east, the Mongols. These nomadic horsemen from Central Asia, under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, swept westward across the Eurasian steppe, conquering nearly every city in their path. They defeated a coalition of Rus principalities at the Battle of the Kalkar River, but withdrew east soon after. 14 years later, however, they returned, this time subjugating nearly all the southern Rus lands. In 1240, they razed Kiev to the ground and incorporated its territories as vassals under the Mongol Golden Horde. The majority of the northern Rus principalities escaped destruction by submitting to the Mongols, whose dominance over western Russia lasted for the next 2 centuries. Several khanates were established along the lower courses of the Volga and Don rivers, the Golden Horde, the Crimean Khanate, and the Khanate of Kazan. These powers exerted great influence over the region, demanding heavy tributes from northern Rus cities, such as Moscow and Novgorod, even though those territories were not directly under Mongol control. By the start of the 15th century, Mongol power across Asia was in decline as new empires rose to prominence, such as the Ottomans in the Middle East and the Ming dynasty in China. In Russia, the rising force was the Duchy of Moscow. Under the reign of Ivan III, 1462 to 1505, Moscow launched a series of campaigns against the Khanate of Kazan to seize control of the upper Volga River. Ivan also conquered Novgorod, the Republic of Pskov, and the Principality of Tver, absorbing them into his realm. By the early 16th century, a centralized Russian state had begun to take shape, stretching from Lake Ladoga in the north down through the Volga Basin in the south. Ivan's grandson, Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, expanded Russian rule even further south, toward the Caspian Sea. In 1547, he had himself crowned as the first Tsar of all Russia, setting in motion a series of campaigns that would drive Russia's expansion eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. This eastern push was initially carried out by small bands of Cossacks, a semi-nomadic people renowned for their skill in horseback warfare. Hired by Russian authorities, they probed deeper into the steppe and beyond. Under leaders such as Yermak Timofeyevich, the Cossacks defeated the Khanate of Sibir in what is now western Siberia. Their conquests triggered a wave of exploratory journeys that carried Russian settlers and adventurers across the vast Siberian wilderness. Within just a century, Russian explorers had reached the Kamchatka Peninsula on the Pacific coast. By the 17th and 18th centuries, small colonies were scattered across Siberia. Russia even turned its ambitions beyond the Pacific. In 1733, the Danish navigator Vitus Bering, serving the Russian Navy, was commissioned to explore the seas east of Siberia. Though his expedition ultimately cost him his life, his voyages charted the Bering Strait and the coastline of Alaska. In 1741, these discoveries spurred Russian fur traders and explorers to establish claims in Alaska itself. Despite these remarkable eastern achievements, Russia's primary focus in the 17th century remained westward expansion. The goal was to strengthen ties with continental Europe and, most importantly, to secure access to a warm water port in the Baltic Sea. At the time, Finland and much of the Baltic coast were under the control of the Kingdom of Sweden, which also dominated the Baltic states. As a result, Russia depended heavily on the port of Arkhangelsk in the far north for its European trade. But its location inside the Arctic Circle made it unreliable, as the sea was frozen much of the year. To solve this problem, Russia engaged in a prolonged conflict with Sweden, hoping to seize land on the Baltic coast and secure the warm water port it so desperately needed. This struggle became known as the Great Northern War. The Great Northern War, fought from 1700 to 1721, saw Tsar Peter I, known to posterity as Peter the Great, defeat the Swedes and claim sovereignty over lands along the Gulf of Finland, as well as modern-day Estonia and Latvia. With victory secured, Peter began constructing a new imperial capital on the shores of the Baltic Sea, one he modestly named after himself, St. Petersburg. Peter's reign was also transformative in other ways. From 1697 to 1698, he undertook a grand tour of Western Europe to study the latest scientific, military, and technological developments. Upon returning home, he applied what he had learned, modernizing Russia and laying the foundation for its rise as one of Europe's great powers. By the time of his death in 1725, Russia had emerged as a major international power after centuries of being seen as a backward and impoverished state. His expansionist efforts were continued later in the 18th century by Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796. Catherine aimed to extend Russian power southward toward the Black Sea. In 1768, Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire, and by 1774 it had seized control of key cities such as Azov and Kerch. From this foothold, Russia steadily pushed its southern borders outward, sending troops into the Caucasus, the northeastern Balkans, and eventually annexing the Crimean Peninsula. Catherine also benefited from the decline of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Weakened by internal strife, Poland became vulnerable to its powerful neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, who partitioned the state in 3 stages, 1772, 1793, and 1795. Russia's share of the spoils was vast, including most of Ukraine, nearly all of Belarus and Lithuania, and part of eastern Poland. This cemented Russia's place as one of Europe's most formidable powers, thanks to both its immense territory and its vast population. Russia's growing might was tested during the Napoleonic Wars. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte launched his fateful invasion of Russia. Though Moscow fell, The combination of Russia's immense size and brutal winter devastated the French army. By 1815, Russia had not only repelled the invasion but also gained new territory, including parts of Poland and Finland, which Tsar Alexander I ruled semi-independently as Grand Duke. Further wars with the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and tribes of the Caucasus added even more land to Russia's growing empire. By the 19th century, Russia had reached the height of its territorial power. Its expansion sparked alarm across Europe, particularly in Britain, which feared that Russian advances might threaten its global colonial interests. In the Far East, Russia secured major concessions from China in 1861, founding the city of Vladivostok, its only ice-free Pacific port. Just a few years later, in 1867, Russia sold Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million, around $151 million in today's money. To offset the loss of Alaska, Russia pushed deeper into Central Asia, annexing the Khanate of Khiva and the Emirates of Bokhara and Kokand, territories in present-day Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan. This expansion brought Russia into direct rivalry with Britain in what became known as the Great Game, a diplomatic and military struggle for control over Afghanistan and Persia, which acted as buffer states between their empires. Despite repeated attempts, neither Britain nor Russia was able to dominate Afghanistan. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, the decline of the Ottoman Empire presented Russia with fresh opportunities. During the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, Russian forces advanced deep into the Balkans, threatening Constantinople. Alarmed, the other European powers convened the Congress of Berlin in 1878, blocking further Russian advances. Instead, new independent states like Bulgaria, Romania, and Serbia were established, free from direct Russian rule. Despite its vast territorial acquisitions, Russia remained economically backward compared to Western Europe. Its rigid, authoritarian Tsarist system created growing discontent, fueling radical movements such as anarchism and communism. This unrest exploded during World War I, when military failures and widespread suffering opened the door for revolution. In 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, and Moscow. A brutal civil war followed between the Reds, Bolsheviks, and the Whites, their rivals, ending in 1923 with the Bolshevik victory. The result was the creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. Although Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states gained independence, the Bolsheviks retained control over the vast majority of the old Russian Empire. The USSR survival was soon tested again with the outbreak of World War II in 1939. Though the conflict was devastating, the Red Army eventually pushed back the German invasion and advanced across Eastern Europe. By war's end in 1945, the USSR had absorbed the Baltic states outright and installed communist regimes in Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and beyond, extending its influence across nearly half of Europe. Though Soviet borders changed little after 1945, the Cold War with the United States saw Russia project power globally, supporting communist regimes in North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Yet beneath the propaganda, the Soviet Union was falling behind technologically and economically. By the 1970s and 1980s, it was struggling to compete with the West. Despite reforms introduced by Mikhail Gorbachev, including glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, the Soviet system was too brittle to survive. One by one, Eastern Bloc states broke away from Moscow's control. Finally, in 1991, the USSR itself dissolved. Out of its collapse emerged a series of independent states, including Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic republics, the Central Asian nations, and at its core, the modern Russian Federation.